In the 1970s, in the dawn of the computing industry, all apps were command line based, implying you had a terminal where you could type instructions, and then these instructions would somehow execute towards the machine. And these instructions could be shell commands or SQL or similar type of types of language instructions that were highly formal in nature, right? So it was complex to interact with a computer. And then later in the 1980s, we realized we could simplify it by providing options, such as you'd have typed out on the screen, "Hi there, welcome to my app. Press 1 to search for a customer, press 2 to create an invoice, press 3 to create a new customer," etc. And these apps too were command line based, meaning they were black and white typically, and they would just write out text on the screen according to what buttons you clicked and or what you wrote into the app. Then in the mid-1970s in Palo Alto, Xerox PARC invented the GUI, graphical user interface, which was later stolen by Apple and Microsoft and became Mac OS X and Windows. And this was a user interface revolution because it made our apps much more intuitive to interact with. And it turned into modern computing the way we're used to perceiving it today, with a graphical user interface with buttons and checkboxes and drop-down lists and radio buttons and etc. However, all of these iterations were hacks. They were simple hacks. Because the way we really wanted to interact with the computer was by using natural language, the way human beings interact with each other. I can, for instance, tell you to please get me a glass of water. And if you are physically capable of doing that and you are willing to do that, you would easily understand my instructions and you would go into the kitchen and get me a glass of water. And that is the natural way we want to interact with computers. So the graphical user interface has now reached the end of the line. And by that I mean that most of the apps we today are delivering with graphical user interfaces will now return back to its origins from the 1960s and 1970s, where we are using textual-based input instructions. But this time it will be natural language and not structured, highly complex, formal computer language. And in fact, every single thing we've ever done throughout the history of computing has been an attempt at bridging between humans' abilities to communicate and the computer's ability to understand highly formal language. SQL, structured query language, mimics the way humans think and communicate. Still, it is far too complex for 99.7% literally of the world's population to be able to accurately use it to query the computer. And the same was true for COBOL, which was invented back in the 1950s or 60s. COBOL was actually an attempt at creating a computer language that was so close to human language that it would feel as if you were just talking to the computer using your keyboard. Now, with AI and GPT and machine learning models such as OpenAI and Claude and Google Gemini, we are at the point now where we can actually use our natural language, and we no longer need to use highly formalized language to talk to the computer and have the computer correctly interpret our intentions and execute some task based upon that intention. And that basically means that 98% of all future GUI development will probably cease to exist. Maybe not 98%, there will still be some very, very few domains that will still require a graphical user interface. Magic itself is a great example of that, but not to the extent we have previously seen throughout the last 3 decades, since Windows and OS X was released. Because the GUI, the graphical user interface, was a hack. It was a hack because the computer doesn't understand natural language. Now the computer understands natural language. With that in mind, let me demonstrate the app I created the other day, just to illustrate how that entirely replaces graphical user interface software development. Here is the app I created in one of my previous YouTube videos. If you remember one of my previous videos, I created a CRM system in 5 minutes, and this is the app: list all functions right now. So if I ask it to list all functions, then what's actually happening is that the AI understands my intentions. And I could write that sentence unstructured. I could write it in Norwegian, Swahili, I could write it semantically completely different, etc., etc. Now, if I want you to list all products for me, right? Let's try again. I was just recently capped by OpenAI, so I had to increase my threshold. Here you can see now it lists the products from my database. Now, if you remember what I told you earlier, then back in the 70s we had to write structured SQL to accomplish the same. Now I can write natural language, the same way the human mind is using natural language to communicate intentions to its peers. Now, this thing you're looking at here, which is basically just, you might say, a clone of ChatGPT, its user interface, can actually replace 85% of every single GUI app ever created. And the reasons for that is because of when I create a machine learning type here, let's have a look at the training data for the CRM guy here. And let's find send email, for instance. You will see here that I actually instruct OpenAI to return this as a function invocation if the user asks the AI to perform an action associated with this function invocation, which just so happens to be send an email. So if I now write list all customers, and then I write I want to send an email to Thomas, right? Customer ID 3. Then the system asks me, okay, my name, John Doe, john@doe.com. Howdy, mate. Did you read my email? What's actually happening now is that this function invocation is returned by OpenAI. Now, 5 years ago, if I wanted to create functionality such as this, I needed to have a send email button. I needed to have a subject input, text box input. I needed to have a body text box input. I needed to have maybe save as a template button in my email client, etc., etc., etc. Today, I don't need that because I simply have a natural language input prompt, a submit button, and AI functions that the underlying machine learning model constructs invocations towards based upon my input. And this method of creating applications completely changes the way we interact with our computers by significantly simplifying our ability to communicate intention to the computer. If you think about any average GUI application you've ever used, let's do HubSpot for instance, it's got thousands of buttons and drop-down lists and text box input fields and etc, etc, etc. And to learn how to master HubSpot is such a huge task that it requires months before you know everything required to use HubSpot optimally. If you noticed from a couple of minutes ago, I just wrote list all functions, and the AI was capable of perfectly listing every single function it can execute. So it's even self-documenting, so you can have a dialogue. If you don't know how to use an AI chatbot, you can ask the AI chatbot, how do I use you? And the AI chatbot starts informing you and telling you what it happens to be capable of doing. And that just completely changes the entirety of our industry. Why? Because nobody wants to learn HubSpot. Spend 3 months learning it at the very least. People just want to have an assistant that they can use natural language to communicate with that does their stuff.